Hey everybody, I've added some examples for DNS using a compose file to store the configurations. So let's take a look. I'll walk through the new examples and we'll see how this is set up. Alright, so here we have the compose file, and at the top we have a stored configuration, a base service, like a variable. We're just going to define this image, device, volumes, environment, the stuff that we're going to reuse for each of these different services. So the idea here is that there are different configurations, different tunneler configurations stored as separate compose services. And that way we can just call them individually. This particular compose file isn't intended to be run with all the services running. So you wouldn't say docker compose up on this file and just run everything. But I'll show you running them selectively in separate terminals so that we can see their output. And the ones we're going to be going over today are new in this tunneler SDK repo, and that's for the stuff for dnsmasq. So starting here on line 31, this is going to be our dnsmasq enabled tunneler. And it's really just like the normal tunneler, except that we're going to have this parameter added. And we're also going to mount a Docker volume on this directory, which is the same directory where we're writing the additional host files. So that's a feature of the tunneler, to use dnsmasq styled hoster or additional hosts. So it's like a hot directory. Now this will be the dnsmasq server itself, starting on line 41. Just found a dnsmasq server container, and we're not modifying that container at all. Just mounting the hosts file there, and then configuring dnsmasq to read that directory where it's mounted. So that's how it gets the hosts, the additional hosts in from the tunneler. And the command to launch the server will echo that configuration into place and then run the server. And then just a busybox container to make sure that this DNS is working. So we've hard-coded the DNS, the name server for that testing client container. And that's the same IP address that the dnsmasq server is bound to in the Docker network. So here's our Docker network, named ZDDNSmasq. All right, that's all the nuts and bolts. Let's take a look at the terminal here and fire it up. So first I'll run the tunneler itself. I just remembered that if I don't give it an environment variable name, it'll load all of the identities from the current directory, which could be what you want in some cases, but this is what I want. So I'm actually going to run that instead. As soon as I get that other one to stop that I started. All right. So we'll run compose run the tunneler with this identity, which is a file that's in the current directory. Right there. So our tunneler is running, that's a privileged container, but it's the only privileged container that we'll need. It's using host networking, so it can configure the ton devices using systemd resolved. Next one we'll fire up is our name server. So as you'll remember, the dnsmasq is the server itself. So we can see there that it's reading from the mounted Docker volume, those host files. And the next one we'll run is our test client, test dnsmasq. So it's running wget against an existing HTTP server, which spits back the IP address from which it received the request. So that would be the public IP of the router that was hosting that echo service. And we can see our tunneler happily churning away. And we can see the queries coming in to the name server in the middle. And so that name server is only listening on the Docker network at this location. And so our test client is addressing all of its requests there by default. And this is just a silly toy command that is exercising a ZD domain name. But you could use, this could be any container doing anything with ZD. Its default DNS for that container is that address that's been hard-coded in the compose file. So if we were to stop that container, our little test client, and instead just run shell, this is the Docker daemon. And that Docker daemon is, this is like an automatic name server configuration for a Docker container. And Compose has, on our behalf, configured the API to use our DNS. So we can get the IP for this domain name all day long. See how it's coming back as a 164. That's an IP in our intercept range. And we can do an ns lookup for that as well. So that IP is coming back from the Docker daemon, which is configured to use ZDDNS in the dnsmasq server right here. So I'm going to post this compose file. Hopefully it gets you started. And there are other ways you could use this. You wouldn't have to limit the dnsmasq server, the name server. You wouldn't have to restrict it to a Docker bridge, but I did get the impression that you wanted to provide ZDDNS to non-privileged containers in an isolated Docker bridge network. So that's the way this is set up. But if you wanted to if you wanted to provide ZDDNS to the host itself rather than the containers or both, you could give the DNS server, the name server, more privileges and make it more visible and configure the guest containers differently. By default, they'll always inherit the name servers of the node through the Docker daemon, but you can also specially configure the Docker daemon to provide specific name servers. So let me know what questions this raises for you, if any. I'll be around. Thanks.